Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My very special guest today is the highly acclaimed author, Tobias Wolff. Thank you so much for being here, sir.
It's nice to be here, Teresa.
At what point in your career did you know you were ready to write your memoir, This Boy's Life?
It was a very slowly dawning realization, to tell you the truth. I never had it as part of my ambition to write a memoir. I'd always liked writing fiction. I liked being able to hide behind fiction. I did use my past and my memories in different ways when I was writing short stories and a couple of novels that preceded that book. But I invented so freely around it, it really wasn't memoir at all. It's just what writers just generally do. They drop the bucket in the well of their past and their memories and use that as a kind of element in their work. And I had begun keeping some notes about growing up with my mother when she was kind of footloose and a little feckless and crazy, but a lot of fun. And for mostly as a bank for future fiction, and also so my kids could know more about, because I didn't talk much about the past at home with my wife and kids, and I thought that they might be interested someday in knowing what their grandmother was actually like, instead of this prim, respectable little lady who was president of the League of Women Voters in Volusia County, Florida. It was a, it was an incarnation of my mother that she would not have recognized earlier, if you know what I mean. Such is life. Anyway, I wanted to kind of make a record of this, and in the way that these things happen, these notes, as I had thought of them, began to take more and more of my interest and time, and finally I had to admit to myself that I was writing a memoir. I tried to disguise it for a while as a novel, but every time I'd start inventing around it, it would collapse like a souffle or something. So I really had to come to an understanding that I was writing something that I had never really wanted to write, a memoir. I liked reading them, the really good ones, but I preferred, especially as I was not a model child, to keep a lot of that to myself. I was afraid of losing moral authority with my children, all that kind of thing, and just of the general embarrassment of making one's life public.
Well, and you said your mother took exception to it, but not in the way you expected.
Yes, she was kind of wry in her response to it. A reporter from the New York Times interviewed her after it came out, and my brother is also a writer, Jeffrey Wolff, and he'd written a memoir about my father called The Duke of Deception. And my mother makes an appearance in it, of course, but they separated when we were young, and we lived on opposite sides of the country. But my mother said, well, if I'd known that both my sons were going to end up being writers, I might have lived a little differently, she said. But no, she didn't have any complaints about the way she was represented, portrayed in my memoir, probably because she's portrayed very lovingly, and obviously she had her weaknesses, but they were not weaknesses of a good heart and spirit, and so that's what you really value in people, and she recognized that. But we had this hideous dog when I was growing up, this Weimaraner with a shredded ear. God, he was ugly. Anyway, I represented him in the book as he was, and my mother was quite offended and said he was a beautiful dog. That was the one big correction. So I put a note in the book to the effect that my mother disagreed with it's funny how people react. A friend of mine told me that his mother was hurt by my portrayal of her. And And what really got her was that I had mentioned in their living room, they had a lamp, at the base of which was a rickshaw driver. And when you turned the lamp on, the rickshaw driver started pedaling. It was wired up in some funny way. And it would you'd be sitting there watching Bonanza or something, and here's this rickshaw driver going nuts beside you, right, for all night. And it was kind of a funny thing to have. And so I mentioned it in the book, and apparently his mother was hurt by this. And later I thought, well, you're the one who bought the lamp, But I had a chance to take that out in subsequent editions, and I thought I would. But when it came to it, I didn't. Sometimes you just have to sacrifice, you have to put other people on the chopping block to keep a good detail in a book. Writers are monsters, aren't they?
Sometimes. Leonardo DiCaprio played you in the movie version of the book. Is that an odd feeling, seeing someone play you on the screen?
It was a little bit. He wasn't as good looking as I was,
No?
of course, but no, I'm kidding.
Yeah. I agree with you.
No. Yes, it was. And that was his first movie role. I thought he was terrific, really. But it was strange because he wasn't me, and he was very brooding. I wasn't a brooding sort of kid. In fact, even through tough times, my friends and I were laughing all the time. And I always had friends with a sense of humor. My mother had a great sense of humor. So that kind of lightness in our lives was a little missing from the palette of the movie, I thought. Not through no fault of his own, it was the script.
Sure.
It was the way the movie was shaped. And sometimes they wandered so far from the book that I'd kind of, the first time I saw it, I'd kind of forget that I was watching a movie of my book, right? And this actually happened. So then they go back, and there's one scene where the kid's riding, down the highway or down the road in a car that he's taken from. He's too young to be driving it. He sneaked out at night. And he's got the dog in the car with him, and I actually had this thought, well, that reminds me of something that happened to me, And then I thought, oh yeah, that's right. Anyway, there were moments of uncanny recognition for me in the movie. Sometimes things that, intuitions the movie makers had that were not really even in the book, but just little moments, and I thought, that's really good. And then other times, they departed from the book in ways that seemed very whimsical to me, but on the whole, I thought it was a very, it was an honest attempt to render a book. And those kinds of books are very hard to do as movies. You really have to change them a lot. It's very voice-driven, and you can't, to my mind, most movies that have a lot of voiceover, the voiceover is really a confession of failure, that the movie has not managed to make itself to succeed as a movie, that it needs this explaining voice beside it all the time. And they kept the voiceover to a fair minimum in this, I thought. And I helped them with that. That was my one contribution to the film.
Your second memoir, In Pharaoh's Army, focuses on your Vietnam service. How hard was it to revisit that era?
That was a harder, once I started writing This Boy's Life, I actually had a lot of fun writing it. In Pharaoh's Army began, again, kind of reluctantly. I had written a story, a short story. First of all, I wasn't even going to write about Vietnam. I decided, there are plenty of other good writers doing this. There's a good literature out there. But there were some stories that hadn't been told about the experience there. So I wrote this short story set there some 25 years after I got back. And when I finished it, I thought, well, that's a pretty good story, and I've collected it in my books. But I also knew that I'd left out things that were very particular to my situation, because everybody's situation was particular there. And I mean, we have this kind of stereotypical view of what a soldier in Vietnam did. In fact, we all did very different things depending on where we were, what kind of unit we were in, all that sort of thing. And so I then wrote another story that really dealt with my own experience. And then, as with This Boy's Life, as I'm writing this, I thought, okay, admit what you're doing and then do it. So that was the process that led me into writing In Pharaoh's Army. Let's see, it came out in 94, so that would, and I got back in 68, so what is that, 26 years after I got back. And I'd started writing it about 3 years before it came out. So, you know, almost 25 years really passed before I could write honestly about that experience. I'm glad I did. It was the thing that was most difficult about it for me, aside from remembering some very painful things, was the sense, you know, in This Boy's Life, the things I did didn't really hurt anybody else terribly. My mistakes were mainly, the consequences of my mistakes were paid for by me. But in my service in Vietnam, I couldn't afford to make mistakes because too many other people got hurt. And also, so many people died over there. 58,000 Americans died, hundreds of thousands wounded, really a lot of them for good. You know, about a half of our homeless people as of 10 years ago were Vietnam veterans, men. It has been the gift that kept on giving, and I felt a terrible responsibility in writing that to get it right, because it has meant a lot to a lot of people.
Was the book cathartic at all for you?
I wouldn't say it was good for me to write it, because I had to face some things that I had been kind of hiding from in my own mind. And once you face them, they don't seem so big. So in a sense, yes, it was cathartic. I don't write for therapy. There's cheaper ways of getting therapy and easier ways. But the effect of writing it was probably in some ways good for me.
You mentioned your short stories, and you're a master short story author. What is it about the shorter format that particularly appeals to you?
Well, partly it's the challenge of fitting a world into a little space, you know, what is Blake's great line, the world in a grain of sand, you know, so it's the challenge of doing what a novelist does, but somehow compressing it and implying a lot, rather than explaining a lot. I love reading good stories myself, and I love the trajectory that a good story sends the imagination on. The story exists beyond its ending then, through the implications that it launches in your mind. And I love that. And also, you know, nothing in our lives is perfect. Our relationships always have some perfection. We don't raise our kids perfectly. We don't treat our spouses perfectly, you know. But writing a short story, I've always felt there's a possibility of achieving perfection, a kind of snowflake perfection. When I look at stories like Chekhov's Lady with Pet Dog, or Joyce's The Dead, or Catherine Ann Porter's Flowering Judas, or Flannery O'Connor's Good Country People, and I could go on naming stories that I would not change a comma in. They are perfect, and it's hard to say that about novels, because you wouldn't even want a novel, in a sense, to be that perfect. It would feel a little constrained, perhaps. But it's the challenge of writing something perfect, doing something perfect.
Have you accomplished that yet?
That would be for others to decide.
You've published several short story collections. Most recently, Our Story Begins, which includes early stories and later stories. Were you tempted to make any revisions to the older story?
I do make changes.
Do you?
Oh, yes. When I prepared the selection, in fact, I happened to mention, you know, that I was working on this selection of stories to a friend, a writer friend, a British writer, Timothy Garton-Ash. And Tim said, well, what's the work in that? You just put them together and send them up. And I said, no, I have to go through them and make sure they're perfect. And he said, well, I don't think you should do that. You're kind of intruding on a work that was achieved by, in a sense, another writer earlier on, the writer you were then. And I saw his point, but I didn't finally agree with it. I said, look, if I see something as I'm reading this story now that gives me pause, makes me wince, throws me out of the story for a minute, it would be a discourtesy to the reader to keep that in there. It's not my image that I'm protecting, it's the story. I want the reader to have the best possible experience of this story. He said, well, you should at least write a note then at the beginning of the book explaining that you've done this. So I did. I thought he was right about that. I do not consider my books holy writ, you know. I'm not a fundamentalist of my own work. If I can see something at any point that can make it better, I'll do it.
In your opinion, what is the best short story you've ever written?
It's a good question. There are a couple. One called In the Garden of the North American Martyrs that I like a lot. Another called Bullet in the Brain that I like a lot. But you know, Teresa, it's a hard question. I have 3 children. If you asked me which was my favorite child, I wouldn't be really, I don't have a favorite child. And in the end, you know, different stories have different virtues for me, so it's hard to isolate them.
How do you think you've grown as a writer?
You know, again, I'm just inside my own head and my own skin, and I just do the best I can all the time. If I have grown as a writer, it would be more apparent to another reader than to me. And in what ways I have grown. I hope I've grown in complexity as I've gotten older in my view of things. I hope I've grown in compassion. I hope I haven't lost my sense of humor. I hope that my language is ever more precise and evocative an instrument for telling the stories that I am telling, but in the end it will be the reader who will judge.
When you're a famous writer, when you've received all sorts of literary accolades, where do you go for advice? Who gives you feedback?
I have a few friends and my wife that I show my work to, and my editor along the way. And they make suggestions. Some of them I take, some I think I won't take. But generally speaking, at this point in my life, I have to be responsible for my own work, and even if someone else thinks that I've made a mistake in going in a particular direction, it's my mistake, and I rewrite a lot. Every time I show anybody a piece, it's been through the ringer, and I am the fiercest critic I have, actually. That's why I haven't got a lot of books out. I've got 9 books, and that's not very many when you say, look at my friend Joyce Carol Oates, you know, or you recently interviewed Margaret Atwood. She has a whole shelf of books, and so part of that is because I spend so darn much time on each thing I write that by the time I show it to somebody else, it's usually just a few things I want to test out on them. I tend not to pay very much attention to reviews because by then the work's already out there and I can't do anything about it, right?
Let's talk about Old School, which has been featured in Big Read's Pioneer Library System brought you to Oklahoma. How would you describe that novel to people who haven't had a chance to read it yet?
Old School is a novel about a young man's increasing sense of vocation to literature, to the love of it and to the practice of it. It is set in a very intense very intense atmosphere of a boys' school in about 1961, 62, boarding school back east. I went to such a school on scholarship. And so a lot of the details of life there are recalled from memory. Some are invented. It's a novel, not a memoir. And it deals with the competition between boys of a very literary bent to try to secure private audiences with a series of writers who visit the school, who will meet with a winning writer who submits a piece of fiction or poetry that is deemed the best of all the submissions. And there's an intensely literary atmosphere at the school. And the writers who visit are Robert Frost, Ayn Rand, and finally Ernest Hemingway is scheduled to visit the class. And he is the god of most of these boys. So that's the kind of setup of the school. It's a novel about friendship, about vocation. It's about the virtues and the costs of competition. And it's not least of all about the operations of class in our society.
What do you want readers to take away from it?
Well, I would hope, first of all, a love of a kind of reawakened love of reading and literature and a sense of its value and how central it can be to life.
Through your work as a professor, you actually get to share your love for books. What are some of the great premises of literature you want to get across to your students?
I'm not interested in teaching literature as a narrow academic discipline. I'm interested in it for the same, in teaching them to read it in the way that it affects me, which has to do with its posing of and testing of questions that are central to our lives. The greatest literature is about the choices we make and the costs of making those choices. Even good choices cost something. They cost all the other choices you're not making. And so I'm very interested in the way in which literature shows people being sculpted by the choices they make. Their very characters being chiseled out, choice by choice, until at the end they have made themselves by these acts of will. Literature takes it for granted that we are not creatures who are wholly shaped by other forces, who have no agency in our lives. Literature takes it for granted that we are ultimately responsible for our lives. And what does that mean? What do we owe others? And what are the consequences of the things we choose to do? So that is at the center of all literature. Going back to, Gilgamesh and the Odyssey and the Iliad. It's a story of people making their own paths through life. And I want to, I suppose, help my students become more self-aware and more aware of their possibilities.
You also teach writing. What's the single most important advice you can pass along to an aspiring writer?
Patience. It isn't going to happen immediately. Anyone learning an instrument knows that you have to be patient, that you're not going to sit down at a keyboard and and play Rhapsody in Blue the first time. That's going to happen maybe some years after you start learning the notes and their values, and you begin to have hands that can do what your mind tells them to do, and then does them almost on their own. That takes a long time. It takes a lot of practice. So my big problem with my students is getting them not to be too impatient with themselves, because they're not writing as well as, we can all hear Rhapsody in Blue and admire it. We can all read a Hemingway short story and admire it. For some reason or other, we know when we sit at a keyboard, we're not going to play that thing right away. But for some reason, when we sit down to write, we think we ought to write masterpieces right away, and we don't. We write like any artist learning an art. We do it slowly and by stages, and sometimes we get stalled out for a while, and then we take a leap. And so we really have to learn to abide with ourselves sometimes.
What do you think about all the changes that are happening in mainstream publishing right now?
I don't have any idea, to tell you the truth, Teresa. My powers of prophecy have failed me many times, and I expect them to continue to fail me where this new world of technology and its intersection with literature is concerned. I just don't know what this all means.
We just have a few seconds left, and I've got to ask you about your writing right now. What are you working on?
I'm working on two different things, really. I'm developing another collection of short stories. I just finished one a couple of weeks ago that I'm quite proud of, about a young couple on honeymoon in Italy and discovering things about each other that they had not suspected before, that they are going to have to live with. And it's called All Ahead of Them.
Great title.
And I'm also well into a novel that I've been working on for a few years now.
Is there any chance that novel will become a memoir?
No, this is not a memoir, it's a novel.
Thank you so much for being here,
I
Tobias.
enjoyed it, Teresa.
And thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.